Hello and welcome to the Shane Show. I'm Shane Connick. So, what's the deal with football this fall? Well, here in New Jersey, on Thursday, the Randolph Rams were out there scrimmaging before competition begins next Friday. Down in Maryland, the Big Ten has just flipped its decision, and it will be having a season starting in late October. For more on the Terps 2020 football season, we're going to bring in Emily Giambalvo, the Terps beat writer for the Washington Post. Emily, welcome to the Shane Show. It's great to have you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Of course. So you wrote a story on August 19th about what the football team was planning on doing this fall despite not playing football. You said they were going to be having groups grouped into red, white, black, and gold, all these rules about quarantine periods and 2-week breaks and all that kind of stuff amid the pandemic. Did you think there was any chance that the Big Ten would reverse course and decide to have a season?
No, I really didn't. I think just from an overarching perspective, I didn't think any organization, any company, no matter be it sports or not, could walk back a decision that big. Like if you make that decision and you're adamant and you say it's not going to be revisited, I really thought it'd be hard for an organization to say, you know what, never mind. I think on August 11th, all of us thought that the other conferences would eventually follow suit. You know, it seemed like maybe the Big Ten was going to be that first domino in there being a fall without college football. And instead, those other conferences carried on. And I think that also put a lot of pressure on the Big Ten and saying, you know, why can the SEC play and the Big Ten can't? And eventually it mounted, and the right medical advancements were also happening kind of alongside that pressure. And it led us to where we are today, where almost all the conferences are officially back to playing this fall.
So we were talking earlier about how you actually have not been at practice and how a lot of these reporters have not been at practice or had the ability to be around the team. With that said, from what you were, seeing on Zoom calls with athletes, from what you're seeing on videos and things like that, how much different does practice seem in Colt Fieldhouse than what it usually is?
I'm not sure because, again, like we haven't been there, but I think the amount of thought that has gone into how to structure practice at Maryland at every school has been significant. Like these coaches are really thinking it through, particularly with contact tracing, with their mind on the season. So thinking, okay, we need to protect our position groups. So if one guy gets the coronavirus, then all the other linebackers aren't also out because of contact tracing. So it's been, very planned in that way to try to minimize the spread, minimize the people affected by contact tracing. And, they're basically all summer we're working in really small groups to where I think like 8 guys at a time were working out, and the strength staff would just be there all day to facilitate all of these different small groups. But then when you get back into the football season, there's no way to do that. You just can't prepare to play football in small groups or without touching each other. So I think to some degree, the start of a season means it's going to just be harder and harder to mitigate the spread. But there'll still be all the precautions as possible.
So weeks ago, the Big Ten did announce that it would not be having a season back in like the middle of August. Maryland athletics was having all sorts of outbreaks, and eventually I believe they did just shut down practices for temporarily. Now, normally year-round, teams are practicing and they're playing and they're lifting, and then as you get toward the season, they're practicing pretty much every day, and that's even months out. Now they had already pretty much shut things down to not have a season, and then all of a sudden they've changed their minds and decided a month before we will have a season starting in a month. So how do you think that players were able to adjust to that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think that's something that maybe we haven't talked about enough, is just what the players are dealing with on a mental basis. Of you have this thing in their life that is football, and it's been this core piece of their life. And suddenly, within the last 3 months, you have someone saying, okay, you're playing. No, you're not. Come back to practice. Now we're suspended from practice because of an outbreak. Now we're coming back. Now we're starting. And it's just kind of being given and taken away. And I'd imagine it's really difficult to deal with, just from the mental perspective. And then also knowing that could happen anytime. So it's like, just because the Big Ten is back right now, you don't know if your team's going to have an outbreak. Is there going to have to be a pause? And I know Brian Combs Brian Cobb's a receiver said something where he was like, every time it started to feel like we were getting in a groove of things, then we had to stop. And then that could happen at any time. So I think it's probably been difficult from that perspective and just establishing a routine. And then from a football perspective, you're kind of going back and forth all summer. You're working on Zoom, trying to learn offenses and defenses that way, and then suddenly implementing it on the field for the first time in months. So I think there have been challenges in both ways, but I'd say just thinking about what the players are dealing with on a human level has probably been pretty difficult.
And speaking of that human level, you might not really have a great idea of this because, like, we keep saying you haven't really been around the team in nearly the same way, really at all in person. But do you know if there are any players or people who have stepped up more, as leaders on this team, especially, off the field?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there necessarily have been singular people that have been pointed out so far as being leaders, but you'd imagine the seniors, the people who have been around are taking on a significant role in helping their teammates get acclimated to the program, to the systems. Because you think about being a freshman or even being a sophomore who's kind of going into his second year with the program, you play your last game in November, and then suddenly spring practice with a second year head coach is supposed to be that super important time where okay, we have a year under our belt and now we're going to really take that leap into year two. And then all of that's gone away. So you think about how many important pieces to the Maryland team are freshmen and sophomores and transfers. And it does seem daunting that those are all the people who are trying to learn and understand Loxley's system without much on-field prep. So I think in those moments, they're really going to lean on the very small senior class and just guys who've been around at least a year or two in the program to kind of make sure they're understanding everything and ready to play.
And especially when you have players like Josh Jackson, who's, a quarterback and, a graduate student and all that, who just opt out of the season.
Yeah, so I mean, you're even just looking at the quarterback position, like you said. So you have Talia Tagovailoa, who is a transfer, brand new. I mean, his first on-field practices with the team would have been last month, and then they stopped, and then they started again. And then you have Lance Lejeune, who's been with the program for 1 year. So your quarterback's the person you really need to understand that system better than anyone. And both of Maryland's guys, haven't been around that long. Where someone like Josh Jackson might have almost had an edge. I don't think he would have been the starter if he had stayed, but you do think there would have been some benefit there to the fact that he had played in the system for a year, and the other two just don't have much experience, if any at all, in Talia's case.
So when you were at the University of Georgia, you were writing for redandblack.com. You were covering Georgia's running backs you wrote a story in 2017 from Nick Chubb all the way to Herschel Walker and all of the great running backs that the Georgia Bulldogs had. When you were covering Georgia, you were the senior staff writer for Georgia's independent newspaper, kind of like the Diamondback at Maryland. And now here you are still covering college football, but now you're doing it for one of the most reputable papers in the country, in the Washington Post. How do you see your role, even though you are still covering college football, to be different because you're working for a paper like the Post that has so much more probably access and also has so much more of an audience?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting transition. So I'm going into my third year on the beat, and I started the Post after college. So I'm 24, and I felt really familiar with covering college football. I had done that as a student. I had gone to availabilities. I knew how it worked. I knew how games worked. I knew what to look for, and it's similar at Maryland. But what's completely different is as a student at a student newspaper, you're your own editor. We're all friends. We're all, we're doing good work, but we're the best ones there. Like the 4 or 5 of us covering football, we're the ones who are making the decisions. And there just wasn't the same amount of pressure as there was, or that I feel now at the Washington Post. So I think for me, the big difference is just that, every story counts. I mean, at least that's how I see it. When I was covering Georgia, I think some days you'd think, okay, well, I'm just going to write a quick story about the tight ends today and call it a day because I have a big exam tomorrow or whatever it may be. And now I really feel like every story has to be, up to a certain standard, because at the end of the day, it's going on the website with the Washington Post logo at the top. And I think that causes me to put a lot of pressure on myself, and like I want to do a good job. So it's been a big adjustment, and just the way I see stories has changed a lot. I think I've just grown as a writer to always look for, like, there always has to be something special about a story. It can't just be like, I'm writing about Anthony McFarland because he played well this weekend. Like that, it has to go one step further and add a different layer to, well, how does that relate to the past year or the week before, where he's heading, or his high school career, or an injury? Like there always has to be that second layer. I think that's something I didn't really realize as a student, but the Post has instilled in me, that we're always kind of looking for a complete, well thought out story that is in some ways something you couldn't get elsewhere.
You were mentioning that with the Washington Post, you feel that you have to write to a higher standard in a way. How many more editors does it go through? And not only does it go through so many editors, but they probably want to get these stories out so much quicker than other publications that you've worked with, considering the Post, as we've said, has this national following and covers Maryland as one of its primary sports teams that it's covering. So with that said, what's the process like after a game ends, and how quickly you have to obviously have the story done, and then how quickly it will go through however many editors it goes through before it ultimately gets published?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, after a game or in any news situation, you are pretty much getting it done as soon as possible. So at a game, that means hopefully having something to file on the buzzer, or, within a minute or two after the clock hits zero. In news situations, you're just going as fast as you can, because you never know if someone else has the same piece of news as you. But that said, like, I think the Post is just exceptionally careful. Like, this surprises people I know, who I have friends who work at other news outlets, and like, as a writer, I don't even have the access to click publish on a story. So like, only editors can physically publish a story. So that means like nothing you see of mine like didn't go through an editor. And then we also have editors kind of like back reading everything, and it gives you a sense of comfort, because they do their job well. But it also just goes back to that standard that like we would never want anything out there that isn't just perfect and accurate and fair. So I think what's really great about the Post is there's just lots of different people thinking about these things and having different perspectives. So I have my primary editor, who I talk to every day and is in charge of college sports. But then, there is a lot of freedom at the Post where not everything I write is related to Maryland sports or even college sports. So sometimes you might, be working with some other reporters in sports who don't cover colleges, and you might be talking to editors who are in other areas of sports. So there's just lots of different thoughts and ideas. And I think ultimately, like, that's what makes our section, hopefully, one of the best in the country, just by having so many different, really smart, great people and editors who are all kind of contributing to this. So it's like, yes, go as fast as you can. But I think we do take a step back and don't just click publish for the sake of clicking it first. There is always someone who's looking at it and making sure, what's going out there is how we want it to look.
And you've also worked an intern with a variety of publications when you were in college and outside of the Washington Post. For example, I believe the AP you actually did something with. You were also covering the Olympics several times for different places. Overall, how does the Washington Post compare to other publications that you've worked for?
Yeah, it's interesting. So I, obviously most of my time in college, I was working for the student paper. And then I covered the Paralympic Games for AP, and that was like a couple weeks. And then I covered the Winter Olympics in 2018 for the U.S. Olympic Committee's website. And that was for, a month and a half or so. And then I've interned at a few places, which is just for summer. So like, none of those are quite as long. But the big thing about the Post, I really think, is just the freedom and the collaboration among departments. So it's like, a big story I wrote last year was about the dog saved from Michael Vick's dogfighting operation. And like, I'm a sports writer and I got to work on that for months. So I think like we see sports through a really broad lens. And because we are a national paper with really an international audience, like nothing's off limits. So I think at, you know, metro city newspapers, sometimes that can feel limiting, where, you know, everything you write has to relate back to this city and this, you know, teams in this town in some way. Whereas at the Post, I feel a lot more freedom to, if I pitch a college sports story or something off my beat, you know, there's really nothing outside our scope, which I think is great. And then the other thing that I love about the Post is that we just have so many smart, brilliant people, whether it be in graphics or photo or video or politics or whatever department it is. And I do think there really is an environment of, you know, hey, we're working on this story, but maybe this story would benefit from having someone involved who's not from sports, and then we're able to make that happen. So I think kind of having that mindset really helps set stories apart and really makes it to where every story seems doable. Because if I couldn't do it on my own, then maybe, you know, someone else from the newsroom can help, and we can make it happen. And it's better than if either one of us had done it individually.
Emily, really appreciate you taking the time today to come on to the Shane Show.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everybody, for tuning into this edition of the Shane Show. We'll see you next time. Catch you on the flip side.